28 dams, built by animals that had been absent from English rivers for 4 centuries, across 1.9 kilometers of water, and the river downstream flooded less than it had in living memory. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of how England returned a single species to a broken river, braced for disaster, and watched something no flood engineer had ever managed begin to quietly fix itself. But we need to go back before we go forward, because what happened on the River Otter in Devon starting in 2015 only makes sense when you understand what England lost and how completely it forgot the loss. Before the 16th century, Devon's valleys moved differently, not because the terrain was different, not because there was more rainfall, because of who lived in the rivers. For thousands of years, beavers built dams across steep upland streams, and those dams turned fast water into something else entirely. Mosaics of ponds, waterlogged meadows spreading back from the banks. Water that did not rush to the sea in hours but stayed in the valleys for weeks, soaking into the ground, feeding plants far from the river's edge, cooling the land in summer and releasing it slowly through winter. Then came the first wave of loss. Beavers were hunted across England for their fur and for castoreum, a fatty secretion from their glands that apothecaries across Europe prized as a painkiller. The demand was steady and relentless season after season. By the end of the 1500s, not a single beaver remained in England. There was no recorded date, no account of a final kill. The species simply vanished from the documents, and the rivers were left to remember their old shape on their own. They couldn't. The ponds silted up, the dams washed away in floods, the floodplain meadows hung on for a generation or two, holding moisture the way a sponge holds water after you set it down. But without anything to slow the flow upstream, the rivers began cutting their banks deeper. Water that had once spread across the plain now raced in a channel straight to the sea. Farmers looked at wet meadows that no longer stayed wet and drained them for pasture. This was rational. The water wasn't lingering anyway. The wetland systems that had taken millennia to form did not disappear in a year or a decade. They disappeared across generations, slowly enough that no one noticed. That gradual forgetting is what I want you to hold on to, because it is the most important thing in this story. By the 20th century, England's hydrologists were building flood models based on river behavior in a world without beavers, steep banks, swift currents, narrow channels. That was not a consequence they were studying. That was the baseline. That was simply England as they knew it, as their parents had known it, as their grandparents had known it. And that assumed normality, not the hunting, not the drainage of the Tudor period, turned out to be the hardest obstacle of all to overcome. Now, if you want to understand not just this story, but the full pattern of how these recoveries actually work, species by species, step by step, I put it together in the Rewilding Complete Pack. It covers the ecology, the resistance, the failures, and the turning points that never make the headlines. The link is in the description, or you can scan the QR code on your screen right now to go directly there. Because what comes next on the River Otter is where that pattern gets complicated in ways I think you need to understand properly. In February 2014, a local man named Tom Buckley was taking his daily walk along the River Otter when he noticed something that had no business being there. He set up a camera trap. The photographs he took reached the press, and the government's response was immediate. The beavers, and there were apparently 2 family groups, should be trapped and removed.
The Environment Agency pointed to a specific disease risk. Echinococcosis is a parasitic infection that beavers can carry, dangerous to humans and to livestock. This was not unfounded alarm.
Infection rates had been documented in some continental beaver populations. Nobody knew the health status of the Devon animals. The Angling Trust, representing around 900 fishing clubs across England, raised a separate but equally serious concern. Atlantic salmon and sea trout migrate upriver to spawn. Their populations in southern England had already been in steep decline, down roughly 50% against the 10-year average at that point. Adding an animal that builds barriers across river channels from the angler's perspective meant deliberately worsening a crisis that was already critical. Farmers in the lower Otter Valley had a third argument, the simplest of all. Their fields already flooded every winter. Adding an animal whose entire ecological purpose is to back water up onto land felt, to some of them, like a provocation. These were not the objections of people who misunderstood nature. They were grounded concerns, and they deserved grounded answers. But none of this was guaranteed to produce those answers. Public campaigns have a way of generating noise without generating evidence. What happened here was different. A retired man named Tom Buckley printed posters that read, Save Our Beavers, and placed them in shop windows around Ottery St. Mary. He had no organization behind him, no budget, no media strategy, just a camera and a sheet of paper. Journalist George Monbiot wrote in The Guardian that the government was behaving like control freaks and that the Angling Trust position did not reflect the views of most anglers he had ever known, people who he described as having a deep connection to the natural world. Surveys conducted near the River Otter and nationally in 2017 found that 86% of 2,741 people surveyed supported beaver reintroduction. By 2019, that figure had risen to 90%. And David Lawrence, the farmer on whose land Buckley had placed his camera trap, never called for the animals to go. He described the damage to his property as minor. His tone was more curious than alarmed. In March 2015, the government moved, but only because specific scientific questions had received specific answers. 5 adult beavers were trapped, examined, and tested. DNA analysis confirmed they were the Eurasian subspecies native to Britain, not an introduced American variant. Then they were tested for echinococcosis. The animals were clean. The conditions the skeptics had set were met. The license was granted. On the 23rd of March 2015, the tested beavers were returned to 2 stretches of the River Otter. Devon Wildlife Trust received a 5-year license from Natural England. The conditions were strict. Annual reporting, continuous monitoring, and a clear understanding that if the data came back negative, the program would be stopped. So it looked like a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, which, in hindsight, may be exactly why it worked. For 5 years, a research team led by Professor Richard Brazier of the University of Exeter gathered data across the entire River Otter catchment, 594 kilometers of waterways, quarterly field visits, annual public reports, and a mandate to follow the evidence wherever it led. In 2016, Devon Wildlife Trust added a male and female from an unrelated genetic line to extend the population's range into the Rivertail tributary. In February 2020, the final science and evidence report was published. And here is where the story stops being beautiful and starts being important. 3 numbers stood at the center of the findings. In October 2019, researchers counted 28 dams backing water across just 1.9 kilometers of river, 0.3% of the total waterway length in the catchment. None of them stood on the main River Otter channel. Every single dam was on a small tributary or side channel. The anglers' central fear that migration routes along the main river would be blocked had not materialized. Then researchers surveyed the ponds behind those dams and found 37% more fish in them than in comparable reaches without beaver structures. And third, one beaver family had built 6 dams upstream of East Budleigh, a village that suffered regular winter flooding. Peak flood flows through the village had measurably decreased. But the finding that stood apart from everything else, the one that had not been in anyone's brief, was this. At a site where beavers had built 13 dams, researchers documented large-scale filtration of agricultural pollutants. Manure, slurry, and fertilizer running off the surrounding farmland were settling out of suspension in the beaver ponds. The water downstream of those ponds was becoming chemically cleaner. Nobody had asked the beavers to do that. Nobody had designed for it. The instinct was just doing what instincts do when you give them room. The fish data, which had been the most contested question from the start, told the same unexpected story. Researchers observed trout actively jumping over beaver dams during high water periods, and juvenile fish, young trout and salmon, were colonizing the ponds behind the dams in numbers. The slow, deep, cooler water gave them shelter from predators, abundant invertebrate food, and temperatures that open river reaches could not provide in summer. When warming water in unshaded channels reaches levels that are physiologically critical for juvenile salmonids, the dams were not barriers to fish. In the ponds behind them, a generation of fish was growing up. The Angling Trust published a statement in August 2020 when the government announced its decision to let the beavers stay. Mark Owen, the organization's head of freshwater, said serious concerns about migratory species remained and that the trust was disappointed the minister had not waited for their own commissioned report before announcing the outcome. The scientific disagreement between research groups continued for years after the project officially concluded. I am not telling you that the opposition was wrong to persist. Science does not end at a press release. But the weight of 5 years of structured evidence had shifted the question from whether beavers could survive in England to how England should manage their return. What came next was not in anyone's plan. The population grew from 2 breeding pairs in 2015 to 15 family groups by 2020, not through any targeted resettlement program. The beavers expanded on their own into the river tail, into smaller tributaries, and by 2022 into the culm and X-catchments in the same county. Water vole numbers, a species that had been quietly disappearing from English waterways for decades, began recovering along the Otter stretch. Nobody had set out to restore water voles. They simply appeared where banks of the right structure had returned. In 2020, beavers entered a nature reserve in Cheshire. In 2021, releases happened on the South Downs and in Dorset. 2 adults placed in an enclosure in Cropton Forest in Yorkshire in April 2019 had grown to a family of 10 within a few years, and in 2022, their eldest daughter moved to a reserve in Norfolk where she established a new colony. In October 2022, the beaver was granted the status of European protected species in England, placing it alongside the bat, the otter, and the wildcat. Trapping, injuring, or destroying a beaver without a special license became a criminal offense. In February 2025, the government opened the way for open releases across England. The first such license was issued on the 10th of February 2025 to the National Trust for a project in Purbeck, Dorset. The first application window opened on the 3rd of March 2025. By February 2026, Natural England had announced 2 further license projects and launched an online mapping tool for assessing potential new release sites across the country. A decision that in 2014 had seemed impossible had traveled from a single camera trap to a national licensing system in 12 years. Only 14% of rivers in the United Kingdom were in good ecological condition when the River Otter trial began. The Devon experiment was not an isolated curiosity, it was a test case for a system in widespread failure. And what it revealed was something that ecological restoration has been circling for decades without quite naming. The knowledge of how to fix the river was never stored in a policy document or a flood management budget. It was stored in the behavior of an animal. The moment that animal returned, the knowledge activated. There's a word worth sitting with: castoreum. The secretion that made beavers valuable enough to hunt to extinction. The substance that apothecaries sold across Europe for 5 centuries as a treatment for pain. The very thing that emptied English rivers of the one creature that had structured them for thousands of years. Language held onto the word long after the animal was gone. And now the word and the animal exist in the same place at the same time again on the River Otter, which is slower than it has been in 4 centuries, cleaner than the models predicted, and filling up with creatures that nobody planned for. 28 dams, 1.9 kilometers, 0.3% of the waterway blocked, 37% more fish, 1 village that flooded less, and a licensing system that now covers an entire country. We did not restore those rivers. We returned the animal that knew how, and we stepped back. Mark Elliott, who led the Devon Wildlife Trust project across all 5 years, said after the report was published that they were all surprised by the ability of those animals to thrive again in English wetland ecosystems, and by their unrivaled ability to breathe new life into rivers and wetlands, most of which, as he put it, are in a poor state. David Lawrence, the farmer on whose land the first camera trap was placed, said at the time that perhaps some fallen trees would need clearing to prevent problems downstream. The clearing never happened. The beavers redistributed the material themselves to where it was needed. That is the sentence I want to leave you with. The beavers redistributed the material themselves to where it was needed. If you have seen something in this story that you think someone else needs to hear, please share it with them. And if you want to go deeper than any single video can take you, the Rewilding Complete Pack is the place I built for exactly that. Link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. There are more stories like this one than you would imagine, and I have many more to tell you. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.